So my task, as I understand it, because this is a session on monitoring alveolar recruitment, and my task as the first speaker is to give you sort of an overview of what alveolar recruitment is, why it's important, etc. Here's my conflict of interest statement. I think it's not very relevant for this talk. I'm not talking about any specific products. What I'm going to talk about is, what is alveolar recruitment? What's the definition? What types of recruitments are there? Why should we recruit the lungs? I think that's a very important question. And potential complications of recruitment maneuvers, and then a little bit of clinical data and some conclusions. So a definition of recruitment maneuver, and there are many definitions in the literature, and I just took a few recent ones. This is from David Ischimelo, enrollment of pulmonary units in a new status of inflation. I think that makes sense. Transient elevations in an airway pressure to open, recruit collapsed lung units, and increased number of alveoli participating in tidal ventilation. I think a reasonable one. And I think very simply, it's expanding collapsed or partially collapsed young lung regions by increasing the transpulmonary pressure. So that's when I talk about recruitment or recruitment maneuver, that's what I'm talking about. So what does it look like? What does recruitment look like? Well, I thought I'd show you this. This is an old slide. It comes from the Handbook of Physiology, 1964, many, many years ago. And it's basically a picture of a lung that's being recruited. It's a cat lung, in fact. And on the top, you can see that there's a pressure-volume curve. Pressure on the x-axis, volume on the y-axis. So what happens when you increase the pressure a little bit? You can see when you increase the pressure to 4, there's a little bit of air that enters the lung, very little. You can see that by the white here. This represents air. And here you can see the volume went up ever so slightly with that increase in pressure. With the next increase in pressure to 8, there's a little more volume that enters. And at this point here, you can see there's quite a bit more volume that enters. You can see that on the actual lung, and you can see it on the volume tracing here. And there's an inflection point. The lung is being recruited. As you go further, the increase in volume, you can see the lung now looks more homogeneously inflated. And at 20 centimeters of water, remember there's no chest wall, so this is a transpulmonary pressure of 20 centimeters of water. The lung looks pretty fully recruited and inflated uniformly. When the pressure volume curve now, when the pressure is decreased on the deflation limb, you can see what happens is the lung loses some volume as the pressure goes down, loses a little more volume. But as you can see at all these volumes, the lung is quite homogeneously inflated. That's one of the reasons you want to do a recruitment maneuver. And as you go further down until you get to 0, essentially the lung is recruited. And this region between the inflation limb and the deflation limb, that's called hysteresis. And this is, I think, a pretty dramatic view of recruitment. When it happens in a real lung in vivo, is not like this exactly because we have a chest wall, so at end expiration, the lung doesn't collapse completely. That's what this looks like passively with steady inflations. What does this look like dynamically? So this is a rat lung now. It's not a human lung, but I'm going to show you. This is a rat lung that's now going to be inflated with tidal volumes of about 7 ml per kilo, starting at 0 PEEP, and then going up to about 10 centimeters of PEEP or 15 centimeters of PEEP, and I'll tell you when that happens, just to show you what recruitment looks like dynamically. So let's get this started. Okay, here's the lung. You can see here that the lung is de-recruited here. There's collapse here, collapse here. With each inflation, there's the recruitment and de-recruitment. Now the PEEP is increased. And you can see now with each inflation, look what happens. The lung gets recruited. The areas of the lung that were collapsed are no longer collapsed. That happens in different regions and happens here. This is the final area that you'll notice. And the lung is now completely recruited. Next breath, keep the PEEP. We're now going to decrease the PEEP. The PEEP goes down to 0. First inflation, pretty uniform inflation. But look what happens afterwards. The very next breath, you can see that there's areas of lung that are de-recruited again. So I show you this because I think it gives a physical picture to what lung recruitment looks like and why we recruit the lung. Recruit the lung to open it up. But you can see a couple of things. It takes some time for the lung to be recruited. Here, it only took 4 or 5 breaths because it's a normal lung to start with. If you have a diseased lung, ARDS lung, it can take much longer. It can take up to hours. The other thing is when you recruit, and now if you don't increase the PEEP, you can see quite quickly the lung de-recruits. So I think this gives a visual picture that's worthwhile thinking about the rest of the afternoon as you think about recruitment and why it's important. Now, what are the ways to recruit the lung? Well, I just showed you one increasing PEEP. There's a number of types of recruitment maneuvers, and I'll show you a picture of this. There's sustained inflations, 40 centimeters of water, for example, for some period of time, 40 seconds. All that, of course, is somewhat arbitrary. There's pressure control ventilation where you can increase the PEEP. There are sighs. They are recruitment maneuvers. We sigh a number of times an hour, probably to recruit the lung, probably areas of microatelectasis. That's why humans sigh normally. There are other approaches, and these are just schematically the recruitment maneuvers I talked about: sustained inflation, incremental PEEP, and decremental PEEP, and pressure control ventilation, where one just increases the level of PEEP. Other approaches are prone ventilation. Prone ventilation recruits the lung, decreases ventilator-induced lung injury. For a while, there was a big interest in liquid ventilation, much less interest in this now because of a negative trial, but it's a way of recruiting the lung, an interesting way of recruiting the lung. And variable ventilation, where you have not having a fixed tidal volumes that change in size. The larger ones basically are like sigh maneuvers. So why do we recruit the lungs? Why should we bother recruiting the lungs? Well, a number of reasons. One is to decrease atelectasis. That'll lead to an improvement of oxygenation. That's been known for many years, at least 50 years, and to improve right ventricular hemodynamics. I'll show you this one study from Duggan. This is from Brian Kavanaugh's group, looking at atelectasis, vascular leak, and lethal right ventricular failure in uninjured rats. So the hypothesis they had was that ventilation, if you didn't do a recruitment maneuver, could induce injury in lungs that otherwise were relatively normal. So they used anesthetized rats, ventilated them with or without recruitment maneuvers, and that the recruitment maneuvers are shown here, and the groups are shown here. And they had a number of endpoints, including microvascular leak, echo, which is important, EM, and mortality. And I'll just show you the results very briefly. Here's the final PO2 in the recruited lungs on the left and the non-recruited lungs. Not surprisingly, the PO2 was lower. That's certainly very expected. Here, however, is interesting, and look in terms of echo, this is right ventricular impedance impairment score. 0 is normal, 12 is markedly abnormal, and you can see after 120 minutes, there's marked right ventricular impairment in the group that was not recruited. After recruitment maneuver, just opening the lung somewhat, there was a marked decrease in that impairment. And that was associated with a decrease in mortality in these rats. So we think about recruitment usually in terms of what I'm going to talk about next, decreased ventilator-induced lung injury, but it's also important to think about what happens with a recruited lung in terms of impact on right ventricular function. So I would say most people think about recruitment in terms of oxygenation, of course, but also in terms of can it be a way to decrease ventilator-induced lung injury. And I think that this editorial by Burkhard Lachmann probably led the way in this regard. He was the one who coined the term, and I think it's a great little phrase, open the lung and keep the lung open. And the concept here was if you keep the lung open, you can reduce ventilator-induced lung injury and improve oxygenation at the same time. Well, what's the basis for this? Well, I think the fundamental paper that in this area is by Jerry Mead way back in 1970. He looked at stress distribution in the lung. They had a theoretical model, then they had a physical model made up actually of condoms that were put together to sort of look like a lung. And what he showed was that in an unexpanded region of the lung, if you have an area of atelectasis beside an area that's relatively well inflated, you can have an increase in stress that varies as the transpulmonary pressure times the volume over the unexpanded volume to a factor of 2/3. What that means is the stresses in these regions can be amplified from 30 centimeters of water up to 140 centimeters of water because of the inhomogeneity. The key issue here is the key factor is inhomogeneity. So if inhomogeneity is a problem, is there a way to homogenize the lung? Well, there's two ways. One, we say keep the lung collapsed, and if you don't inflate it, that's fine. Keep the lung deflated. Or the other is, can you inflate the lung and keep it then more uniformly inflated, and therefore decrease these stresses. There are other stresses and other issues if you do that, but that's sort of the concept. One of the studies that looked at this is Peter Rimmensberger. The idea here was to look at the effect of a recruitment maneuver on lung injury. So this was an ex vivo lung model, 2 hours of ex vivo ventilation. Essentially, what we did was use the model I showed you before, the video, and had a control group with CPAP, basically for 2 hours, kept the lung inflated. Then PEEP used less than the inflection point, PEEP less the inflection point after a sustained inflation, after a recruitment maneuver, or PEEP greater than the inflection point. And here is what it looked like schematically. So here is the pressure on the x-axis, volume. Here's the pressure volume curve. You can see here, this is the group with PEEP greater than the inflection point, relatively high. Group without a psi maneuver, sustained inflation maneuver. You can see that the volume and pressure are shown here. Pressure and volume are shown here. After a sustained inflation, after recruitment, you now have the ventilation occurs on the descending limb of the pressure volume curve. So what's the impact of this? The PEEP level was identical, as you can see. Well, here's the lungs that were not ventilated, pressure versus volume, before and after the 2 hours, not ventilated, no change in the pressure volume curve essentially. Here is PEEP greater than the inflection point, overstretching the lung, and you can see that after 2 hours, the post-PV curve was decreased. There was a decrease in compliance. What happens without the psi maneuver? And you can see now this is ventilation below the inflection point. You can see that the results look pretty similar to this. In fact, worsening. If you look at the pressure volume curve down here, worsening of the pressure volume curve compared to not ventilated. And what happened in these animals if you provided a sustained inflation? You can see essentially no change in the pressure volume curve, suggesting that by inflating the lung, by recruiting a lung, you can decrease ventilator-induced lung injury. Same ventilatory setting, same PEEP level, same tidal volume. It wasn't just the pressure volume curve. When the pathologist looked at these in a blinded fashion, you can see the degree of injury. Look at the total airway injury score. Higher is worse. You can see with the sustained inflation, relatively low score, in fact, lower than the other two groups, but much lower than PEEP less the inflection point without the sustained inflation. So evidence that sustained inflation in this admittedly not clinical model could show a decrease in ventilator-induced lung injury. And there's many other studies that have looked at the beneficial effects. As with any therapy in the ICU, any therapy in medicine, we also have to think about, excuse me, what are the detrimental effects? And there are detrimental effects of recruitment. These depend on the type of recruitment maneuver, as I'll show you in a moment, whether you do a sustained inflation, whether you size, whatever you do, very different. The dose, clearly, the higher pressure, if you used a sustained inflation to 30, 40, 50, 60, clearly the injury is going to be different, or the side effects. Underlying type of injury, whether it's primary or secondary ARDS, and the relative stiffness of the lung and chest wall. Because the importance here is that we usually think about an inflation, a sustained inflation, thinking about what the airway pressure is. But really the important pressure is the transpulmonary pressure. And that's usually not measured. So what are the negative impacts? Well, there can be increased hypoxemia. In fact, if you increase the pressure too much. Ventilator-induced lung injury is important. You're doing the sustained inflation to recruit the lung and decrease ventilator-induced lung injury, but it can actually lead to increased ventilator-induced lung injury. This is a paper from Su and colleagues published 15 years ago. Looked at a lung lavaged rabbit model rather. They did a pressure volume curve, measured the inflection point, P-flex, and they had 3 ventilatory strategies. A control group, ventilated P-flex for 3 hours. A non-derecruitment maneuver, that's NDRM. They kept PEEP at 2.7, lower the inflection point, and then for 1 hour, then keep PEEP at the inflection point for 2 hours. And then they did what they call DRM, derecruitment maneuvers. And what they did was that they had 6 cycles of PEEP, increase the PEEP to recruit, decrease the PEEP. Increase the PEEP, decrease the PEEP, over a matter of, these lasted 10 minutes or 20 minutes. The average length of time that the animal spent at 2.7 or peak of P-flex was identical in both, but you can see that one allowed the lung to be recruited, de-recruited. Not in every breath, but over a half-hour period. And they measured a number of things. This is the lung injury, and you can see here that hyaline membranes inflammation and bronchiolar injury. This is the control group, non-de-recruitment maneuver in the center, and on the right, the de-recruitment maneuver. And you can see that the injury in all of these areas, all of these types of injury, was increased by allowing the lung, if you recruit it, if you don't keep it recruited and allow it to de-recruit, that can actually worsen injury. The other major effects of recruitment maneuvers are cardiovascular. And this is the ones that are well known, I think, the ones that we think about, and I think are the most important and are pretty self-evident. This is from that paper I showed you earlier. This is John Marini's model, where they looked at different methods of applying a recruitment maneuver. This was an animal model, and you can see pretty dramatic results. This is a sustained inflation to 40 centimeters of water. The cardiac output dropped by 65%. 65%. That's a huge decrease, obviously, in cardiac output, big concerning. And we know that in patients, you know, a drop in blood pressure and a drop in cardiac output is one thing to worry about. This is taken from a paper looking at low tidal volumes, recruitment maneuvers, and sustained inflations to look at ventilator-induced lung injury and to look at mortality. This was a clinical trial, large clinical trial. Part of the clinical trial was doing recruitment maneuvers. And I'm just going to show you those data on one slide. Essentially, there was no significant difference in mortality between the low PEEP and the high PEEP group. But what I'm showing you here is recruitment maneuvers. This is the side effects of the recruitment maneuvers in this trial. The complications were about 11%, with mean blood pressure dropping below 60 and 4.5. There were transient desaturations, new leaks, new arrhythmias, relatively small numbers, but all potentially important. And 1% of patients, 3 patients, soon after the recruitment maneuver, developed new onset severe barotrauma, and 2 patients eventually died due to the severe barotrauma. So there can be complications that are important when you recruit the lungs. We're trying to do the right thing to decrease ventilator-induced lung injury, but it can be harmful. So where are we now with recruitment maneuvers? Well, if you think about this, what we have is a balancing act. We're trying to reduce ventilator-induced lung injury with low volumes, high pressures. We're trying to decrease oxygen toxicity, which we can. We do recruitment maneuvers. However, on the converse side, we can have increased ventilator-induced lung injury from higher pressures and high volumes, and we can certainly have circulatory depression. So where are we? Well, there was one meta-analysis that looked, or a couple of meta-analyses. This is one that looked at recruitment maneuvers in adults with ARDS. And this is the forest plot from that, and essentially shows that it looks like the recruitment maneuvers, now this is in the context of open lung ventilation, showed a decrease in mortality, and just recruitment maneuvers had a not quite significant decrease in mortality. So the data suggests that there is a decrease in mortality, but it's certainly not very persuasive. So what are the conclusions? Well, I think use of recruitment maneuvers, there are multiple approaches. The prone position has a lot of evidence for it. I'd suggest that is a very useful approach. Increased CPAP, PEEP, there's a number of approaches which I mentioned. This can lead to greater homogeneity, but can never completely homogenize the lung, or you'd have to be at such a high volume that you're going to kill the patient due to impact on hemodynamics. And it may be associated with decreased ventilator-induced lung injury. There are, however, a number of caveats. The effectiveness depends on many factors. I mentioned some of them during my talk. The key issue here is that we have not come to consensus about what the best approach is to do these recruitment maneuvers, to recruit the lung. Implementation varies, I would say, almost dramatically, from the odd sign maneuver to the kind of high sustained inflations that I talk about. It's important, no matter how you do it, to monitor hemodynamics. I think that can be acutely life-threatening. And at post-recruitment maneuver, it's important to think about how do we make sure the lung stays recruited. Because I showed you, if you allow it to de-recruit, you may actually be doing more harm than good. And I think that the potential advantages would benefit from clinical trials that address this directly. The key issue, of course, in all of these, if we're going to do a clinical trial, how do we monitor recruitment? And in fact, that's the topic of a number of speakers this afternoon. What I've tried to do is give you a little bit of background, so when you listen to the speakers, you have some idea of sort of why we do it, how we do it, and is it useful. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take some questions.